Welcome back to day 5 of our 10-day workshop on Facets of Modern India, a truly masterclass of ideas of India, I must say, by top class, best and brightest from India. We have an excellent panel lined up in the coming days on strategic culture, foreign policy, democracy, disarmament, and disaster management, all leading in their own domain to give you glimpses of modern India on this virtual platform. I'm especially delighted to share that Swami Vivekanand Cultural Center at Embassy of India in Seoul, under the dynamic leadership of our ambassador and her team, has been a pioneer, in fact, a first in starting this truly intellectual enterprise. The sole mission is to develop a rich and nuanced understanding of India, modern India, the civilization, the state, in all its diverse manifestations amongst audiences abroad that always wanted to know more and more about India. We started the workshop on 1st of September with the inaugural address of Dr. Vinay Shastrabudhe on the idea of India, something which embodies the essence of India and the Indian identity. Day 2 of the workshop witnessed the special lecture by Professor Makarand Paranjape on Indian philosophical traditions, and he shared his perspectives on Swami Vivekanand and Indian Renaissance. On day 3, we had an informative description on the National Education Policy 2020 by Professor Rishikesh Senapati, Director of NCERT. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Chairman of RIS, gave a brilliant exposition of Indian economy in transition, along with challenges of Indian growth model and India's economic diplomacy in a post-COVID world on day 4 of the workshop. All the lectures are on our social media handles, and you can go back to them for any future reference. Well, friends, let us begin with today's special lecture, which will be followed by open house discussion and live interaction by the participants. I'm extremely honored to have amongst us Ms. Indrani Bagchi, Senior Diplomatic Editor at the Times of India, a leading English daily, who is joining us live here today from New Delhi, along with the presence of Her Excellency Shri Priya Ranganathan, Ambassador of India to Republic of Korea, for today's special lecture on media, state and democracy. With these words, let me call upon Ambassador Shri Priya Ranganathan for her opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Indrani, once again, such a pleasure to have you as part of our lecture series. I think you were starting to mention the kind of regard and the kind of awe in which the press is held in India, especially by bureaucrats and diplomats who always try to help our friends in the media understand why we do what we do, when we do, how we do. And what I can say with a lot of satisfaction is that amongst my many friends in the media, I think Indrani is one person who has always been very ready to hear our point of view and also to take into account a lot of the contextualization that we try to offer. While of course she has served as one of the fiercest critics of many of the things that we have done, I think at the same time we have always had this capacity to be able to share our perspectives with you, Indrani. And what I hope that we will get out of this session today is a little bit of insight for our friends in Korea into the nature of the Indian media, the kind of independence that it enjoys, the kind of strong foundations on which it is based, and the role that you see for the media in a way the changes that have come about over the past few years, when there has been, I guess, more focus on breaking news thanks to 24/7 audiovisual media, and less on the more, how should I say, news weekly or fortnightly magazines, which used to be the mainstay for many of us way back in the 1980s and the 1990s. So once again, Indrani, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and giving us the pleasure of your insights into this very, very important session. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We now move over to the special invited speaker for today, Ms. Indrani Bagchi, who is Senior Diplomatic Editor with the Times of India, where she reports and analyzes foreign policy issues for the newspaper. Ms. Bagchi covers daily news on foreign affairs, the Foreign Office, as well as interpreting and analyzing global trends with an Indian perspective. She writes news stories, opinion articles, news features, and blogs on the Times of India page. She calls this blog a wide canvas through which she looks at the world and how India responds to it. She covers India, US, China, Pakistan, terrorism, nuclear weapons, and national security issues, among others. She joined the Times of India in 2004. Earlier, Ms. Bagchi was associate editor for India Today, a premier news magazine. She started her journalism career at The Statesman, where she was the weekend editor, before moving to the Economic Times in Calcutta to edit the Metro magazine. Having graduated from Loreto College, Calcutta University, she has been a Reuters Fellow at Oxford University. In 2010, Ms. Bagchi was awarded the Chang Lin Tian Fellowship by the Asia Foundation to study US-China relations at the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. She's also a member of the ESPAN Global Leadership Network. She brings years of journalistic experience and diplomatic reporting to her sharp analysis in her columns and contemporary debates in the Times of India. Let us hear to your special lecture on media, state, and society, and your perspectives on media, state interface, and societal interactions in India today. It's a personal pleasure and delight to welcome you once again and look forward to your insights. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sonu, and thank you, Shripriya, and welcome to everybody else. Good morning, good afternoon. I hope I will be able to answer some of your questions. But as I said, I belong to the sector which, in my view, is the most dynamic, the most noisy part of India's democracy. But the media and entertainment space in India is where democracy, politics, social movements, aspirations, injustices, celebrations, in all their color, noise, etc., collide and cooperate. That makes us a very dynamic sector. We are often called the fourth pillar of a democracy, and I think in many ways we fulfill that role. The role that we assay as the media in 2020 is perhaps different and more unique than we have been there before. But I just wanted to walk you back a little bit, that the Indian media is very closely related to India's freedom struggle, and as well as its efforts and its development as a democratic, a politically and a socially diverse nation. So the founder of the first newspaper, we sort of go back to a man called James Hickey, who started what was called the Calcutta General Advertiser, also known as the Hickey's Bengal Gazette, which was in 1780. Calcutta, and which is now called Kolkata, and Madras, which is now called Chennai, were really the centers where newspapers sprouted. The Calcutta Gazette, the Bengal Journal, the Oriental Magazine, the Madras Courier, the Indian Gazette, and later the Hindu. What you see later in the Indian media, we saw the growth of the media in during the independence movement. But after the independence, after we got our independence in 1947, the role of the media changed subtly. It then became a sector which really pushed the boundaries of India's democracy, and pushed the boundaries in terms of defining the boundaries, defining freedom of speech, freedom of expression, It's interesting, but the Indian Constitution doesn't have a separate section that guarantees freedom of speech, unlike, say, in the US Constitution. What we do have is freedom of expression, speech and expression, which is enshrined in the fundamental rights. And even in the debates that led to the writing of the Constitution, the framers of the Indian Constitution did not actually think that they needed to have a separate space for freedom of speech. But what did happen is that freedom of speech, the definition of that, in fact, the definition of that freedom of speech was immediately, shall we say, curtailed in the initial years after independence, because the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution put in a couple of words called reasonable restrictions. Now, the Indian media was supposed to be free, but with reasonable restrictions, which meant that, at least it said that in areas such as national security, etc., there could be curbs by the state. In the past 60, 70 years, this area has been an area of deep contestation between the media and the state. The media has pushed back against this, the state has pushed back. So when we have had really strong governments, as in, say, the Indira Gandhi governments, or in the present government, we have to push back much harder. In the early days, say during the Nehru government, or in the early 90s, for instance, in fact, all of the 90s, we had a very different space. And in fact, in many ways, the media expanded its own universe. So, so much of the, if you were looking at what the relationship between the media and the state, which is part of what is called press freedom, it is an area of deep contestation. And that deep contestation is actually important. It is very healthy for any democracy. What does define the relationship between the media and the state is not only the legal battles that we have had with the governments of the day, in whether we can publish stories, whether we can push against governmental restrictions, etc. It has also been defined by which other parts of the Indian democracy pushes the idea of press freedom. In a way, the judiciary has been with the media for a long time, even though in many cases, the judiciary goes after us by using contempt rules, by using libel, defamation. All of these rules are used to push back against an encroaching media. We push back in our own way. Between, say, 1950 and, say, 1990, a couple of things had happened. The state was very, very strong because there was a lot of the industry, a lot of the sectors of production, etc., were nationalized. Your banks were nationalized. So financing for media houses, for media entities, needed government permission. Newsprint, for which, and here we are still talking of only the print media, because the print media was actually predominant in those years. So newsprint, if you had to access newsprint, if you had to buy newsprint, mainly from overseas, you needed government permission. If you needed financing to expand your operation, you needed government permission. Your journalists were paid, their salary structures were settled by the government-sponsored wage boards. So honestly, the newspapers, etc., while there was press freedom, the governments also used these methods to constrain the media, or to regulate, or to make sure that they were heard more than everybody else was heard. So, so yes, so those battles we have seen. I mean, I remember in the 80s. We were. I wasn't personally there because I joined a little later. But there was a huge scandal, a defense scandal called the Bofors scandal, and the newspaper where I first started, which was the Statesman in Calcutta, Statesman started an enormous campaign against the then government, which was the Rajiv Gandhi government. The government came at the newspaper with a very heavy hand. So a lot of financing was stopped. The government went after the owners of the paper. You know, it just, so the government pushed back enormously in those days. In the 1990s, then you know, as you know, that it led to Rajiv Gandhi losing his government in the next elections. This was the years when India was more of a socialist structure. Before this, during Mrs. Gandhi's time, during the emergencies and in the 70s, because she was such a strong leader, and she was so she was intent on having her word in. There was a lot of restrictions put in on newspapers and in the media. All of this slowly changed when liberalization happened. When economic liberalization happened in 1991, it was not only an opening up of the Indian economy, it was an opening up of many, many sectors of the Indian system, and media was among them. There's one interesting fact about Indian media, which is almost 95% of Indian media today, and even then, even in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, were all in the private sector. No state media, except for the first television channel called Doordarshan, which went on for a long time. Radio remained in government hands for a very, very long time, and in fact, it still does. But newspapers were very much in the private sector. So as I was saying, when we moved into the liberalized regime, things became much easier. Government control over the factors that that governed production, manufacturing in India, of say printing presses, etc. in India, became looser. It made it much easier for newspaper companies, media companies to access newsprint without government sanction, to access new technology, printing technologies, publishing technologies from overseas, again, without government restrictions. So in a sense, that led to a blossoming of the media space. But you know what it also did? It made the companies very, very powerful. So sometimes you will hear people in India saying, oh, you know, the great days when the editors were so big, when the editors were like giant personalities. In fact, It used to be said about the editor of the Times of India, which I belong to at present, that he was the second most powerful man in India, the first being the Prime Minister. And but those days started to go away, because once liberalization happened, the companies, it started becoming corporatized. Media became corporatized, and therefore the levers of power, shall we say, moved from the editor, the powerful editors, to a very powerful managements. That led to its own dynamics or its own power inequalities, shall we say. So for journalists, we were not only pushing for press freedom from government, from institutions, from establishments, we were also pushing for freedom from our own managements, because when it became a corporatized structure, revenue, remember, the income for the media sector comes from advertising. When it comes from advertising, the people who call the shots are the corporate entities and less journalists. Journalists would say, you know what, you want to advertise in the Times of India, go right ahead. I will still write a story against you if that is warranted. As the advertisers suddenly became a lot more powerful, because they could then tell the management of the newspaper that, you know what, I will not advertise in your paper because your paper is really, really unkind to me. That led to management's pressuring editorial to say, maybe you should think about this a little more, because this company gives us lots of money, etc., etc. Now, these are the troubles, these are the aspects of our daily lives that corporate media like us, and we're really, really large. Just to let you know that the Times of India is the largest English language newspaper in the world. We overtook the Wall Street Journal several years ago. And even in language terms, I think overall in the world, the Japanese newspapers are probably just a little ahead of us. But in India, that's a different story, which I will get to later. So freedom, expanding of horizons, etc. So we became more technologically advanced. We became, our newspapers became flashier. We got top quality production, all of that. The content remained the same. The content, in the sense that we are an extremely intensely political nation, as you know. So politics takes a lot. Politics, as the economy expanded and liberalized, we became stakeholders in the economy. We became commentators of the economy. We became reporters of the direction the economy was taking, should take, etc. But something more happened. In the 90s and the early 2000s, India was post-liberalization. The new generation Indian was also looking at their own aspirations, their own. So, for instance, we discovered something very interesting. Our surveys, we discovered that the first newspaper that, you also have to understand that Indians were slowly getting out of poverty, slowly getting out of illiteracy. So we discovered that the first newspaper that a person picks up as a literate person is actually a newspaper in their mother tongue. But the second newspaper is always English. And That because English remained the language of aspiration, but along with that aspiration came a whole lot of other aspirations: education, employment, technology, lifestyle, health, science and technology, environment. All of these areas started to grow in terms of newspaper or just media interest, because media interest was always and is today as well a reflection of popular demands. We are probably the most sensitive to popular demands, perhaps even more so than politics. And as you know, electoral politics in India is very, very finely tuned to what people want. So you're looking at, so we are now in a space where the corporatization of media becomes, by the way, the Times of India was the first media house to become a corporate media. And this was followed by almost everybody else. The 1990s also saw the birth of two things. One is birth and flowering of the blossoming of two other parts of the media. One was television, and the second is vernacular media. A little later was the growth of digital media or online media. But television changed horizons and changed the nature of media completely. Because again, television was in the private sector. It started out with deep pockets. It did not end up with deep pockets. However, because television's financing system was slightly different from newspapers. In many, many places, as in the Times of India, it is still the newspaper which is the flagship brand, and we finance or we subsidize our TV channels. And something similar happened to many other TV channels. But TV channels just exploded across the country. Politicians started to invest in TV channels so that they could get their point of view across. We see a lot of that in South India. Each region, each state, each linguistic cohort had their own television channels. There are close to 900, or maybe we've crossed 1,000 TV channels across the country. We also, the 90s and the 2000s also saw the growth of vernacular media. And we say vernacular media, which is really language media. It is not just English. It is Hindi. I mean, there were parts of the country that were already deep in language media. I mean, for instance, West Bengal. Bengal has always been very, very strong with its own language media, as has been Kerala. In Malayalam media has always been very strong. They have a reach that is much bigger than English language media. It may have helped that both these states had communist governments, and media is a very big part of their own messaging. But language media flourished in many, many places. I mean, Hindi, Gujarati, Rajasthan, different dialects of Hindi, Marathi, you name it. Every region came up with its own newspapers. They would be bilingual. They would have an English language paper as well as a regional language paper. This led to what I called democratization or the localization of news. So it was no longer the elite English newspaper journalists who were calling the shots on politics, society, what is cool, what is not, what is trendy, what is not. that elite structure completely crumbled, and news, information, entertainment, all of it became a lot more democratized. So they became local. There were local television channels that were very, very popular, that were very powerful, much more than, say, Times of India sitting in New Delhi. This has led to the kind of noise and cacophony in Indian television that is probably unique to the world, in the world. No, in fact, if you look at the circulation figures of non-English media, they overtake us by miles, English media has its place as a traditional place, which it continues to occupy, a place of very large influence. But language media has completely changed the landscape of Indian media. It has changed the landscape of the relationship between the media and the state, between the media and society, between the media in and of itself, and that has changed how people perceive the media. In the last, I would say, the last 10 years, we have watched a further. I mean, some would call it deterioration, some would call it another phase of television, news television, which is the infusion of what is classified as entertainment. So television has become a lot more, shall we say, coarse. There is a coarseness to television. There is a lot of shouting matches. There are television anchors who are stars in their own right, but who are very brash, very in your face, and they practice a version of journalism that is very different from the kind of journalism that is practiced, say, by the print media. That has its own charm, that has its detractors and adherents. Some people like it, some people hate it, some people turn off television, some people change channels. But the fact remains that news television in India today is partly news, but partly entertainment. You will find television anchors dressed up in spacesuits. You will find television anchors using an intemperate language. You will find the kind of media trials of celebrities, of issues that did not exist earlier. But that's reality. That is still reality. What we do see also is that the state remains a player. The state remains a player in terms of news, in terms of access to news, you will sometimes wonder what it is that keeps Indian media sane, largely free. And I would say that the sheer size and the variety of Indian media is one of the factors that helps. The fact that many media houses are also corporate entities means that you do have corporate backing. There is the Supreme Court, the judiciary has over the decades been a strong pillar of support of the media, especially by its judgments. That remains to a large extent, not as much as it used to, because even the judiciary has become a player, because we do see an activist judiciary as well. But then there is public opinion. All of this, and competitive politics. There is competitive politics everywhere. All of this keeps balances, sometimes not as much as we would like, but things generally balance out. And that, in a way, is the strength of the Indian media. And let me not forget to mention one aspect that keeps Indian media free, and that is its journalists. Indian journalists take a lot. The kind of professionalism that has been demonstrated by journalists over the decades against many, many odds, to bring stories forward has, to a great extent, kept the reputation of the Indian media being what it is. You can argue that there are that journalists, like other sectors, have also become more partisan lately, and that is true, because Indian society, it is a reflection of Indian society, and Indian society, like in many other democracies, has become polarized. There is a degree of polarization in politics, in society, and therefore in society. And as media, which is a part of society, we are not immune to this. So yes, there is the kind of rules, the kind of unspoken rules that perhaps we, in my generation, we followed, are not the rules that this current generation follows. Through all of these imperfections, we continue to get the story out. We continue to do the kind of reporting that could still bring down governments. And it has happened. So you will find people saying, you know, Indian media is really dead, and etc. I think our death is greatly exaggerated. And now I come to the next part of the evolution of Indian media, which is the growth of online media. If as a corporate media entity, I feel constrained to do certain stories, online media is an open space. And online media has evolved so rapidly and so beautifully that in many places they challenge traditional media like us. In online media, unlike us, does not have to be registered at the Registrar of Indian Newspapers. So there is a degree of freedom in online media that they are making the most of, and from all of us, we say more power to them. The next part of the growth of Indian media is the gradual demise of print media. In many ways, I am in a sunset industry. In the last 5 years, we have seen the new generation reading their news not in the newspaper, often not on television, but on their mobile phones. That means a couple of things. One, for online media, that's a great space. For traditional media, we are having to evolve very, very quickly. We are having to become members of or sort of participants in this online, in this digital media revolution. We are having to reckon with the fact that less and less people want to buy newspapers physically. We found, for instance, in Bombay, in Mumbai, that if your newspaper did not arrive at your doorstep at before 6 a.m., which is around the time that most people in Mumbai leave their homes to get onto commuter trains to commute to work. That if your newspaper did not arrive there before 6 a.m., it is most likely that that person does not get to read the newspaper. And if this happens for more than 3 days, they cancel the newspaper. They would much rather read it on the app on their phone, or they would come back and watch it on television. It has put in new challenges to traditional media like us. In a way, television has also been challenged because online media has the kind of immediacy that even television doesn't have. As print, we were challenged by the immediacy of television. Television is now challenged by the immediacy of social media and online media. So television has taken the path of quasi-entertainment. Print has to take a different role. And in my view, we are looking at two twin roles. One, we use the skills that we have as journalists, as traditional media, to make the most of online media. Second, we are in a very interesting space of being able to get ahead of the news, to create or to write more original long-form content. Three, we are the first place that people would still turn to for interpretation, analysis of current events and current affairs. That still keeps us relevant. But even this is changing, because even this is moving to the online space. And in my view, COVID has accelerated the death of the newspaper. For many, many parts of the country, during the lockdown period, people didn't buy newspapers. Many people, after the lockdown, discovered they didn't need the newspapers. So in a sense, we are moving to where Western newspapers are, which is, most of them have moved online. And we are moving at a much more accelerated pace towards that space. How do we make money online? What would be the rules of journalism? Journalism will always remain, of course, but what would be the rules of that journalism? How immediate do we want to be, or how much do we sit back and analyze or interpret events? So we are, in a sense, we are also redefining our own roles in traditional media. We will come out on the other end. I certainly believe that we will come out much stronger at the other end, because we have the kind of skills, we have the kind of backgrounds, we have the kind of expertise in journalism that is almost unmatched. And that is, I'm certain that will see us through. I will stop here, and I hope you have questions, so maybe we can take those. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Ms. Bagchi, for your fascinating lecture and giving us an overview of the functioning of media in India. Based on your rich experience of reporting and journalism in India, you have very aptly summarized the growth and evolution of media industry in India, and especially in very simple words for our participants, you have very wisely summarized the transformation of media industry, how it has transformed from the state control to the present liberalized regime. And you analyzed about the changes that took place during the years of early 90s, and how we saw blossoming of the media space, particularly proliferation of TV channels, rise of vernacular media, and the growth of digital platforms. And thereby the challenges that came up, you have very wisely also highlighted those challenges. And these have been maybe positively, we can say these are some of the good developments, but then rise of online media has been a positive development, but then this has also challenged the traditional media. And you have also highlighted about the gradual demise of print media, especially in the post-COVID era. So that is one thing that we have to be really concerned about. And then you have focused on corporatization of media industry, the technological advancements that we have seen in the media products that we have, changes in the content, democratization and localization of media industry, and how news channels have entered into the sector called infotainment. That is one area that is really attracting people, more and more youth to towards the media industry. And also very aptly you have summarized what keeps Indian media sane and largely free. And just I would like to highlight the points that you said: the size, the mere size of Indian media industry, the variety that they offer, and the active judiciary, public opinion, the competitive politics that we have, and professionalization, professionalism of the journalists. But these have been some of the you can say specific. You have highlighted some of the specific issues that have kept the Indian media largely free. So many thanks, Ms. Bagchi, for giving us this overview. And before we open the floor for interaction, maybe I can just pose a question. Being the moderator, let me take this advantage, because I'm sure many of our participants would also be interested, and maybe they might also ask this. But just one issue that comes to the mind of people, since we are based outside India, here in Seoul. So when we interact with the local community here, one concern which they always raise is that why is media covering all the negative news? So Ms. Bagchi, maybe if you can give an answer to our participants, the local participants who are based in Seoul, or who are also joining from other parts of the world. Why is the focus only, we understand that raises the TRP, and yes, that is maybe more attractive for the media sector, but the image that it is giving to the outside world is a really matter of concern. So Ms. Bagchi, if you can respond to this. Meanwhile, our participants, they are preparing their questions.
So there is a rule, which is bad news is always more attractive. If we were constantly highlighting the good things that a government is doing, or at least what the government says it is doing, then we would be part of the government's publicity machine. We are not. The reason why we are there is because we are there to put a check on, to scrutinize government functioning, to scrutinize events. We are very different from a PR section, a public relations section. It is not, I mean, I get this from a lot of government, that why don't you say good things? I'm not there to say good things. I am there to hold up a mirror, and that mirror may not be a good mirror. Now here, there are a couple of things that happens. One, a strong government will push back. They push back and they tell you, no, this is, what you are covering is wrong, etc., etc. Fake news is the new way of describing journalism. That may be true for some parts. It is not true for the large part of journalists. Second, nobody reads a newspaper because they want to listen to the great achievements of the government of the day. They don't. Yes, we do cover a lot of good news stories. We do. There's no getting away from it. We do cover a lot of good news stories. Now, television is a different beast. Television lives, if you look at news television in many, many parts of the world, that they derive their sustenance from the prime time discussions. And those are prime time discussions. People will stay only because if there is drama, there is some degree of entertainment and some news. But for people like us who bring out a newspaper, it is incumbent on us to provide news, not to provide good news. If a news is bad in whoever describes bad, then so be it. We don't determine the goodness or badness of news. We are there to report. If bad things are happening around us, you cannot expect us to say, how wonderful the world is. We won't. For that, there are official channels who will do that. But to add to something else you said, a real danger and a real problem that we are all battling with, both governments and the media and traditional media, is disinformation or fake news that has now become a menace. Because with the proliferation of technology, with the proliferation of digital content, the kind of what we call gatekeeping, where you verify the story with 2 sources, 3 sources, that kind of gatekeeping is gone. And because that kind of gatekeeping is gone, that space is being occupied by polarized parts of society. So partisan reporting, partisan interpretations, partisan analyses, all of this proliferates. It becomes a daily struggle for all of us to have to separate what is fake from what is real. That makes our jobs much harder. Frankly, it makes your jobs as government also much harder.
Thank you, Ms. Bagchi. Now we see some questions in the chat box, as well as also some of the hands have been raised. May I request Ms. Bahuguna, Nidhi Bahuguna?
Just one point. It was an excellent talk, and she Mrs. Bagchi brought out her side of the story, the media side of the story, which we often overlook. But I just wanted to ask her one thing. She said during Nehru's time, media was much more free, but wasn't the First Amendment brought in to control media? That is what I wanted to ask her.
No, I did not say at all that Nehru's time it was free, because he was the one who brought in the First Amendment that put curbs on media, on freedom of speech. Nehru, the only difference between Nehru and his daughter was Nehru was a little more laid back, a little more benign personality. Mrs. Gandhi was a much more in your face, much stricter, much more dominating personality, and therefore she would take many more steps that he may have said, okay, fine, let them be, etc. But she would use the power of her position to push back against media very, very obviously. And if you remember, the emergency happened during her period. It was Mrs. Gandhi who put the emergency out, and the newspaper that I first belonged to, which was the Statesman, we for days we carried blank spaces in our editorials. We did not submit the editorial for censorship. In fact, at some point I will address the topic of censorship when that comes about.
Thank you. Can we take a couple of questions together?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. We have a question from Miss Meena. Miss Meena, she's a Korean friend who is joining.
So hi, I'm a Korean American film producer, and I have worked on Bollywood productions, and I found so much connections with the Indian and Korean culture. And I would like to pursue the projects that I can show the different perspectives of India, not like those old traditional ways. And I believe the reason why that the foreign medias are showing the poor, like poverty and the bad news about like each other, is kind of like part of like superiorism, thinking that we are better than that country. So I would like to concentrate on the stories that we would like to share. So, as a media professional to you, I would like to ask what kind of perspective that you would want us to show about India, and what kind of things that we have not seen that we can, newly introduce in our contents.
Thank you. Thank you, Miss Meena. Let's take another question. We have another question from from Hansol. Mr. Lee Hansol. That question will be taken up by one of our team members. Can somebody take up the question raised by Mr. Lee Hansol?
Yeah, so one question from Mr. Hansol Lee. Yeah, thanks for the great lecture. I think there are many similarities in terms of the relationship between media and funds, a rise of new media, etc. One of the difference between the two countries would be its scale. Even in Korea, which is smaller than India, most of news are focused much on the capital. India is bigger, and I wonder how local media is working.
This question is about the scale of media in India. And one last question in this round. Miss Deepal Mehta.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you for your great lecture. Actually, I would also like to bring it to your knowledge that I also used to be a part of Times of India in Gujarat. Like during 2018 and like 2013, when we used to have the I Lead India campaign, which was carried out in 27 states around India. Yeah, I learned a lot of things from my editors in Times of India, Vadodara in Gujarat. Right now, I am working with the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism in South Korea, and I also work as a journalist at the Korea.net, which is under the ministry. Also, I would like to ask you this, like being a part of the media, I would like to ask on behalf of the people over here, like what do you think about the corporate and political ownership of media outlets? Like, do you think it influences the reality of the incidents that occur and are telecasted or published?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mehta. Ms. Bakshi, now you can respond to these questions. Then we will take up the second.
So to answer the first question about Western portrayals or Western descriptions of India, yes, I have no hesitation in saying that a lot of Western reporting on India is very cliched and without taking into account the nuances of society, the changes in society. So if you were to look at India, I mean, frankly, this is not me saying it, but that it's one of the most famous sort of truisms about India is that whatever you believe about India, the opposite is also true. We are so large and so diverse that you can find pretty much every shade of opinion, every story you can find. If you are looking for poverty journalism, you will find a lot of that. But if you are looking for social transformational journalism, which tells you how Indian society has transformed, at least in the last 25, 30 years, you will find really rich content. You will find even richer content in terms of how the Indian economy has progressed, not progressed. There is no dearth of content. But what I try and ask everybody from overseas coming to report on India is, don't go by just what you see in a big city in India. Because there is an India that is outside the big city, that is outside Delhi, Bombay, Mumbai, Bangalore, and in parts of India which are so different and so rich and so interesting that you will find yourselves lost. For instance, I mean, how many of you know that in parts of India, in the Northeast, people watch Korean serials in Korean without subtitles. I mean, K-pop is not just a thing in the West. K-pop is huge in India. Korean beauty, for instance, Korean beauty product, the entire beauty industry of Korea has takers, growing numbers of takers in India. These are things which you may or may not be able to get either if you sort of confine your reporting to Delhi or to Mumbai, etc., where there are the same cliched stories of the Indian corporate sector or Indian politics, etc. That's always there. But there is another India that's growing, that's developing, and I always urge people to look at that India. That's a lovely story that is growing completely organically. The tech sector. There are sometimes when we hear stories, when we find it hard to believe that, is this really happening here? And that's what I urge people to look at. The second question the second question escapes my mind, but the third question is whether the corporate entity or the political owner of media influences their coverage. Of course, no question. There is your politics, your corporate interests, all of them influence, but not to any appreciable degree. And why do I say this? Because, as I said, there is no story in India that can remain hidden. So let us assume that your corporate bosses have a story that they don't want published. It's a great story, but they don't want it published because it impacts their interests, their political interests. You may not be able to do it. 10 days later, somebody else has done it. You have no choice but to follow up that story. So no story is hidden in this country. You may not get it today, but you will get it day after tomorrow. But it's there. Somebody will carry it. Somebody will cover it. And that, in a sense, is a check on overtly partisan coverage or overtly partisan influences on any media. That's what keeps us all balanced and sane. But I missed the second question.
Was it related to the scale of media industry and how the local media operates in India?
Right. So the scale it's vast, of course. I mean, I think after the US and China, we are the largest media industry. We have an annual sort of annualized growth rate of about 9 to 10%. I'd say COVID will retard that a bit, but yes, and this includes newspapers. There are almost 110,000 newspapers and periodicals and magazines that are registered, and I'm not even going into the ones that are not registered. There are over 900 television channels in different languages in India, and then there is online media. There is radio. A few years ago, the government privatized FM radio. So FM radio is in private hands, but by and large, radio remains in government hands. And then there is the huge Bollywood film industry. And we say, you only look at Bollywood, but the film industry in different parts of India, very deep and very extensive. For instance, in South India, all the 5 states of South India have their own very well developed film industries with rich writing, rich content, superstars that can match any Bollywood superstar. In Bengal, which is my home state, we have had a very, very strong movie history for many, many years. Maharashtra has a similar, we have theatre, etc. These are all old methods of entertainment and communication, and all of those still remain. So the media industry it goes well beyond news. It goes into entertainment, it goes into information, it goes into advocacy, it goes into public relations, it goes into a wide variety of sectors, and all of that becomes the media. So you can begin in Bollywood and you can end up in Bengal or Chennai, but it's the stories are similar. And in fact, it has happened over the years that a particularly successful film in, say, Tamil or in Bengali has been translated into a mainstream Bollywood film. Just like the number of Korean films that have been remade as Indian films. There's an enviable number of Korean films that have become Indian films. So yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Bagchi. Let's take some more questions. I request all the participants who are asking the question, please briefly introduce yourself also. Miss Shipra Raj.
I'm Shipra, and I teach media studies at Delhi School of Journalism, University of Delhi. And I'm also a doctoral research scholar at Center for Culture, Media and Governance, Jamia Millia Islamia. I'm talking about freedom of speech and expression. You said that it sort of balances out. So is it also true for current times in India? Because there are so many incidents where of state censorship or killing of journalists in India. So is it also true for current times? Because emergency, we know that what happened. But there are people who say that though media is free and independent, but it is constantly under attack. So what will you say about that? Thank you.
I would say media is definitely under attack. If we remain largely free, it is despite these efforts. Yes, but I also have to tell you a little more about journalists. If journalists are a reflection or a part of the society that we live and work in, the kind of partisanship that you are seeing, and since you're a professor of journalism, you would know that, the kind of partisanship that you are seeing in politics and in everyday life does not leave journalists untouched. A lot of the time, what you are seeing is also political rivalries playing out. I would say that there is a greater attempt by the establishment in many states. And I know that BJP states do take a little more active interest in journalists. I can tell you that the same happens in Bengal, which is not a BJP state, in a couple of other states which are not, again, BJP states. The fact is that the state has found that it is easier to target journalists today more than before. So yes, in a sense, media is under attack. There are stories, there are reports of journalists being lynched, being killed for their writings, for their television, for their news coverage. There are journalists who are fighting the state in places like Kashmir, and we cannot, all of those journalists are ours, and all those stories are ours. You can say that there will be people who will push back against this and say that the stories were wrong, factually incorrect, and deliberately targeting certain people. That may well be the case also. I'm not saying that we remain pure and everybody else is not. That is not my point at all. Whether a journalist should be lynched or killed for his or her work, you can contest the work. You can contest that. You can contest the factual veracity of that work. Should they be killed for it? I don't think so. And that is something we are seeing quite often, and something that is a matter of great concern for all of us.
Next, let me invite another question. We have a question from one of our Korean friends, Miss Yozen.
Okay, thank you for your lecture, and I have two questions. The first is, what do you have to say about media trial? Yeah, and the second question is, what do you have to say about paid news in India? Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. A media trial is something we hate, and everybody should too. There are times when the pursuit of a story can become partisan targeting, and we have seen that happen. So a media trial is something there is a fine difference between a media investigation and a media trial. In the age of the kind of television that we are currently experiencing, oftentimes we don't see an investigation, we see a trial. We see the media being the judge, jury, and execution. Those are all, and that is not regulated because we don't have a media regulator. We should rely on ourselves to regulate ourselves, but in the pursuit of better TV ratings, we do see some degree of media trial, which is very disturbing. About fake news, I spoke about it a little while ago, but it is a real problem. The fake news, disinformation, these are part of the new technologically replete lives that we lead. And fake news is something we battle. Almost all big media entities have set up their own fact-checking systems to be able to separate fake news from the real stuff. it is becoming more and more difficult as technology advances, because you can fake an event and on a media platform with the kind of finesse that you couldn't earlier, and which also makes it very difficult to detect. So we do fall prey to fake news a lot of the time. But that, in my view, is the biggest danger that we face as a society and as the media. Because among other things, the average person does not distinguish if fake news is showing up on your WhatsApp feed or on your own social media feed, and there is no gatekeeping. You can believe something absolutely weird. It is our duty to filter news. Often we fall prey to it. But then we, let us say the Times of India, we can control what we put out. What we can't control is, say, what's going viral on Twitter, or what's going viral on Facebook, or what's going viral on WhatsApp. That becomes very, very difficult. And for people have been killed for stories that have been circulating about them that are absolutely not true. So it is a real and present danger.
Thank you. Thank you. There are some, we'll just, maybe this can be the last round of questions. Mr. Prajwal, and then Mr. Rohan. Please, one by one, please unmute yourself and be brief with your questions.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your lecture, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Prajwal and I am pursuing my master's from Allahabad University. My question to Ms. Bagchi ma'am, that do you think Indians are aware about media and information literacy? If yes, then it's okay, and if it's not, how can make them aware about media information literacy? Thank you, ma'am.
Media information and literacy. Mr. Rohan, you have a question?
Ma'am, thank you for this lecture. My question was, till what extent a media trial directly or indirectly influenced the judgment of any court in any sensitive case matters recently held in past few years? Thank you, ma'am.
And can we take one last question, Mr. Dhananjay?
Hi, ma'am. I am Dhananjay. I'm a law student from Tamil Nadu. My question is, ma'am, we have seen from the examples of Al Jazeera and BBC that media is a tool for cultural diplomacy. So, how do you think India can expedite on that angle? That is, media being a tool of cultural diplomacy. That's my question, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
You can respond, Ms. Bagchi, to these questions.
So, a media trial is whether it influences judgments. I don't think so. At least I would like not to think so. But that is actually a question more for the judiciary and not so much for the media, because the media does put people on trial. I mean, we are right now in the middle of a media trial in India about a Bollywood actor who died by suicide, and his girlfriend. There is a media trial on. Whether it's justified, whether it isn't. I mean, what the final judgment ought to be, my view should be left to the courts. But as I said, in the search for TRPs, for ratings, for TV ratings, a lot of this is about a media trial. Media illiteracy, media and information literacy. So we don't teach that. Nobody teaches that. But there is, the average Indian is an extremely aware person, a very, very, very aware person. That they do not get into. Most of them will not fall for the kind of stuff that you are thinking about. Mostly what you would say is that once you are, it's not even a question of whether you are illiterate or not. Because I have seen some of the most literate people being media illiterate and some of the most illiterate people being very, very media savvy and very media aware. So I don't think that is a problem. Your last question about BBC and Al Jazeera, I urge you to look at the funding patterns of both. Al Jazeera is owned by the state of Qatar. By Al Jazeera's coverage, Al Jazeera's politics is deeply influenced by the politics of the ruling family of Qatar. BBC functions on a license fee basis, and BBC functions with a lot of, in many ways, we grew up with the BBC. But BBC, I don't think, does the kind of cultural diplomacy that you are thinking of. BBC, by being itself, is a different, shows you what a free media should be, or what free reporting should be, or could be. But again, I would say that not all that the reporting that you get is either free or unbiased. So would I use them as a gold standard? No, I don't think so. My sense is that we are all living in a very new world, and our rules, etc., are also changing. So I think we will need our own models, neither Al Jazeera nor the BBC. As for cultural diplomacy, you see, the very fact that we exist is an attribute of India's soft power. The fact that a free media, a sort of rambunctious media exists, functions in an imperfect way, sure, but reflects society, holds society up for scrutiny, holds governments up for scrutiny, itself is a statement of India's soft power that we would not have been able to achieve if it had been a controlled, if governments had controlled the media. So just by being what we are, just by being true to ourselves, our professions and our ethics, we are cultural ambassadors for India.
Thank you, Ms. Bagchi, for your brilliant exposition. In fact, it's been almost 1.5 hours, and very nicely you have summarized everything, and you have been very generous with the time also, taken up each and every questions, and I'm sure you must have given enough food for thought to all our participants. This is the 5th day, almost halfway of our workshop, and I'm sure all the participants from India, Korea, and other parts of the world must have gained a lot from your lecture and about the working of media industry in India, and the way you have very wisely summarized how it has evolved, the growth of media industry since the time of independence up to the present times, and also the challenges that the industry has faced over the period of time. So many thanks once again from Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center, Embassy of India in Seoul, for your time, and for also taking up all the questions and being present here. Thank you, thanks a lot, and thanks to all the participants once again for coming to this 5th day of the workshop, and thank you to the team of Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center and Embassy of India for providing all the technical support. Thank you once again.